There are truths that the desert holds better than any grave. Truths about what a person is capable of doing when cornered, when all that remains is the choice between dignity and survival. The Arizona sun does not distinguish between saints and sinners when it punishes the cracked earth, but men make this distinction every day, and sometimes that distinction costs more than any treasure buried beneath the fiery dunes. Samuel Harrison, 52 years old with skin tanned by the relentless sun, never imagined that he would find a woman hanging from his barbed wire fence one September morning. Not there, 3 miles from his secluded estate, where even coyotes avoided passing during the day. Samuel had built his life on that forgotten piece of land, precisely to avoid encounters like that. 16 years of growing dry corn and raising a few cattle had taught him that solitude was a fair price for peace. The woman hung unconscious, her long brown hair clinging to her sweaty face, her blue dress torn in several places by the cruel barbs of the wire. His delicate hands, clearly unaccustomed to heavy work, bled where he had struggled to free himself. Around her neck, even through the wounds and dirt, Samuel could see a golden necklace that gleamed against her pale skin. It was a fine piece, delicately crafted, the kind of jewelry that did not belong in those barren lands where survival was worth more than any ornament. Samuel got off his horse with careful movements. 40 years in the West had taught him that surprises rarely brought good news. Her eyes scanned the horizon for signs of pursuers as her expert hands cut through the wires that held the woman together. She was young, perhaps 25, with features that spoke of a sheltered life, far from the harshness of that merciless world. But his barefoot, injured feet told a different story, the story of one who had run long and long. When he freed her completely, Samuel felt the weight of her body in his arms. It was too light, as if days had passed without a proper meal. His lips were chapped with thirst, and small cuts covered his arms where the thorns of the desert had left their marks. But it was the necklace that caught Samuel's attention the most. It wasn't just an expensive piece of jewelry. There was something about it that spoke of family history, of inheritance passed down from mother to daughter through generations. The hot wind blew hard at that moment, kicking up clouds of red dust that danced around the two of them like ghosts from the past. Samuel looked once more at the horizon. There were no smoke signals, no horse footprints other than his own, but experience told him that a woman like that did not get there by chance. Someone was looking for her, and that someone probably didn't mean well. He carried it to his wagon carefully, protecting his head from the bumps on the way back to the farm. All the way, Samuel couldn't take his eyes off that necklace. He had seen many jewels over the years, some stolen, others earned through questionable means. But that piece had something special, something that spoke of love and care, not greed or violence. It was the kind of inheritance that a mother would leave to her daughter, loaded with memories and blessings. Samuel's farm appeared on the horizon as an oasis of civilization in the midst of the wild vastness. It was neither large nor luxurious, but it was solid. The wooden house, built by his own hands, withstood strong winds and sandstorms. The well he had dug in the early years still provided fresh water, and the small barn housed his few animals. It was a place where a person could hide from the world if necessary. He took the woman into the house and laid her in her own bed, the only one she owned. He covered her with a clean blanket and left a basin of fresh water next to it, along with some clean cloths for when she woke up. Samuel had long learned that caring for the wounded was part of life in the West. Everyone eventually needed the kindness of a stranger to survive. While she slept, Samuel prepared a simple stew with the vegetables from his garden. The smell of food filled the small house, mingling with the aroma of aged wood and tanned leather. Outside, the sun continued its relentless journey across the sky, but within those thick walls, there was freshness and silence. It was a refuge, and Samuel suspected that this was exactly what the woman needed. The hours passed slowly. Samuel went about his business, fed the animals, repaired a broken fence, checked the water level in the well, but his thoughts kept coming back to the stranger in his bed. Who was she? Where had he escaped from? And why would anyone chase her for a necklace, no matter how valuable? In the West, people killed for much less, but there was something about that situation that didn't fit the usual patterns of greed and violence. As the sun began to set, painting the sky red and gold, Samuel heard a low moan coming from the room. The woman was waking up. He approached the door but did not enter. He had learned that frightened people needed space to orient themselves before facing strangers. He waited patiently, listening to the soft sounds of her moving on the bed, probably trying to understand where she was and how she had gotten there. Night came slowly, bringing with it relief from the scorching heat. The stars began to appear one by one in the dark sky, and the silence of the desert settled over the farm. It was on this kind of night that Samuel most appreciated his solitude, but this time, the stranger's presence changed everything. There was a tension in the air, a sense that important events were about to unfold, and Samuel knew from experience that this kind of foreboding was rarely wrong. Fear has its own smell, an acrid odor that mixes with sweat and dust, revealing secrets that words try to hide. Samuel had known this smell since the days when he hunted men wanted by the law, before he decided that solitude was worth more than any reward. It was the smell of someone who had seen death up close and knew that it could return at any moment. The woman appeared at the door of the room when the first stars were already shining in the dark sky. Margaret O'Sullivan, 27, the only child of an Irish merchant who had built up a small fortune selling supplies to miners in Colorado. She held the doorframe tightly, as if her legs still couldn't support her weight completely. Her green eyes, even swollen with fatigue and tears, revealed a keen intelligence and determination that suffering had not been able to break. Samuel sat at the kitchen table, his calloused hands wrapping around a mug of warm coffee. He didn't make sudden movements. He didn't ask questions. He had learned that frightened people spoke when they were ready, and forcing confessions only drove away the truth. Margaret looked around the simple but clean house, her eyes lingering on the details that revealed the character of the man who had saved her. Well-kept books on a makeshift shelf, tools arranged with military precision, a worn-out Bible on the mantelpiece. She approached slowly, one hand instinctively shielding the golden necklace that still glittered against her neck. It was a beautiful piece, crafted with intertwined flowers that seemed to dance in the light of the lantern. But more than its beauty, the necklace carried a story that Samuel could read in her eyes. It was all that was left of someone much loved, probably the only thing of value he had in the world. Margaret sat in the chair opposite his, her hands shaking slightly, as she accepted the coffee mug Samuel pushed toward her. The hot liquid seemed to return some color to their pale faces, but their eyes kept scanning the house, as if they expected enemies to emerge from the shadows at any moment. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that allowed two wounded souls to recognize each other. When she finally began to tell her story, it was with the broken voice of someone who had lost everything that mattered. 3 weeks ago, 4 men had shown up at his small house on the outskirts of Denver. They were no ordinary thieves. They knew details about his life, about the necklace he had inherited from his mother, about the sentimental and financial value of the piece. They had waited until she was completely alone, vulnerable, with no neighbors nearby to hear her cries for help. The leader of the group was a man she knew by sight, Thomas Brennan, a merchant who had done business with her father years ago. He knew about the necklace because he had been present at his mother's funeral. He had seen the piece being placed around Margaret's neck as a last maternal gift. For 2 years, Brennan had been planning how to get that jewel, studying her habits, waiting for the right moment to act. Margaret had managed to escape only because she knew every loose plank in her house, every window that opened without making a sound. As the men discussed how to force her to hand over the necklace, she had slid out the back window and run into the darkness of the night. But they had followed her, and the persecution had lasted for days. She had stolen horses when she could, walked when she had no choice, always moving south, always trying to keep her distance from her pursuers. The necklace wasn't just an expensive piece of jewelry. It was the last physical memory of Catherine O'Sullivan, a woman who had crossed the Atlantic at the age of 16, and the determination to build a better life in America. Catherine had worked as a seamstress until she had enough money to open her own shop, had married a kind man for love, had raised Margaret with solid values and unconditional love. The necklace had been a wedding gift, bought with the savings of months of hard work. Samuel listened to each word without interruption. I had met many Thomas Brennans over the years, men who confused opportunity with entitlement, who thought the vulnerability of others was an invitation to exploitation. He was the kind of man who made the West a dangerous place for decent people, who turned the struggle for survival into a constant war between predators and prey. By the time Margaret had finished speaking, her tears had dried, but her voice carried an iron determination. She wouldn't hand over the necklace. No matter what Brennan and his men were capable of doing, She would not betray her mother's memory by handing over the only inheritance she had received. It was a matter of honor, the kind of principle for which people were willing to die in the Wild West. Samuel got up slowly and walked to the window. Outside, the night was clear and silent, but he knew that this peace was deceptive. Men like Brennan did not give up easily, especially when they believed their prey was cornered. They would come, perhaps not that night, but soon, and when they came, they would bring violence and determination in equal measures. He returned to the table and looked directly into Margaret's eyes. There was an unasked question between them, a question that would define what would happen next. Samuel had spent 16 years avoiding exactly this kind of situation, fleeing conflicts that were not his own, building a life based on neutrality and isolation, but some situations did not allow neutrality. The woman in front of him had not chosen that fight. She had inherited a treasure that represented love and sacrifice, and now violent men wanted to wrest it from her through fear and force. It was the kind of injustice Samuel had seen many times in the past, the kind of situation he had learned to avoid in order to maintain his peace of mind. But looking at Margaret, seeing the mixture of fear and determination in her eyes, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The wind changed direction outside, bringing with it the smell of dust and sage, but also something else, the distant odor of horses and men on the move. Samuel closed his eyes and concentrated. Their instincts, dormant from so many years of enforced peace, have awakened like animals sensing the approach of a storm. Brennan and his men were not far away, maybe a few hours away, maybe less. Margaret noticed the change in his expression and rose from her chair, her hand instinctively returning to the necklace. He had recognized something in Samuel's eyes, a calculated coldness that spoke of experience in violent situations. It was the same expression he had seen on Brennan's own face, but different. Where Brennan showed cruelty, Samuel showed determination. Where Brennan revealed greed, Samuel demonstrated something she couldn't fully identify, but which made her feel safe for the first time in weeks. The decision was made in that silence loaded with meaning. Samuel did not need to speak, and Margaret did not need to ask. They had become allies in a war that neither had chosen, united by circumstance and by a moral code that still existed in some people, even in the Wild West where the law of the strongest used to prevail over every other principle. Violence in the West never came with fanfare. It arrived like a snake in the desert, silent, deadly, inevitable. Samuel had learned this during his years as a bounty hunter, when the difference between living and dying was measured in seconds and in the ability to read the signs that others ignored. That morning, the signs were everywhere. The abnormal silence of crickets, the restlessness of cattle in the pasture, the way their horses moved their ears toward the north. Thomas Brennan arrived with the rising sun, bringing with him 3 men whom Samuel recognized by type, if not by faces. Jake Morrison, 41, a former soldier who had learned to kill during the war and had never stopped. His cold eyes and scars on his hands told the story of someone who saw violence as a work tool. The other 2 were younger, hungry for Brennan's approval, the kind who would kill for a few dollars and sleep peacefully afterward. Samuel watched from the window as the 4 men approached on horseback, their silhouettes silhouetted against the reddish morning sky. Brennan rode in front, his upright posture revealing the arrogance of someone who was used to getting what he wanted through intimidation. He was a well-dressed man in clothes that spoke of business success, but there was something about his movements that betrayed his true nature, the predisposition to cruelty when civility didn't work. Margaret was hiding in the barn, following Samuel's instructions. He had spent the last few hours preparing the farm as if it were a battlefield, moving furniture, checking ammunition, creating escape routes. 16 years of peace had not erased the instincts he had developed during his violent youth. His fingers still remembered the weight of his Colt 45, and his muscles still responded to the commands of a mind trained to kill when necessary. Brennan stopped his horse 50 yards from the house and screamed through the silent morning. His voice carried the confidence of someone who had the numbers and the weapons by his side. He wanted Margaret and the necklace, and promised that no one would get hurt if she showed up voluntarily. They were lies, of course. Samuel had heard similar promises before, always followed by violence when the victim let his guard down. Men like Brennan left no living witnesses. Silence stretched between the house and the knights. Samuel could feel the impatience growing in the group. Morrison, especially, showed signs of wanting to end the situation quickly and move on to more direct methods. He was the kind of man who preferred action to negotiation, violence to words. Samuel knew that their patience would not last long. When it became clear that there would be no peaceful surrender, Brennan signaled to his men. 2 of them dismounted and began to move in opposite directions, trying to surround the house. It was a basic but effective tactic, forcing the defender to divide his attention and create multiple pressure points. Morrison remained mounted, rifle at the ready, covering the movements of his comrades with the experience of one who had participated in many similar battles. Samuel moved around the house with economy of movement, each step calculated to minimize noise and maximize efficiency. His Winchester was loaded and ready, along with enough ammunition for a prolonged fight. But he knew he couldn't win with guns alone. 4-on-1 were bad odds, even for someone with his experience. He would need to use the terrain, the house, and especially his ability to think faster than his opponents. The first shot came from the east side of the house, shattering a window and sending shards of glass flying across the room. It was a warning shot, an attempt to scare Samuel into surrendering. But the sound of Winchester responding immediately made it clear that the house would not be taken without a fight. The shell found its target. One of Brennan's men fell with a scream of pain, clutching his bloodied shoulder. The battle really started after that. Shots came from multiple directions, forcing Samuel to move constantly to avoid being surrounded. The thick walls of his house withstood the first shots well, but he knew they would not resist forever. Morrison had dismounted and was coordinating a systematic attack, using his military experience to pressure Samuel from all sides. Margaret watched from the barn, her heart pounding with each sound of gunfire. She could see Samuel moving through the house through the windows, his actions precise and calculated, like those of a man who had faced similar situations before. There was something almost artistic about the way he anticipated the attackers' moves, as if he could read their intentions before they even executed them. The siege slowly tightened. Morrison and his men were experienced enough not to expose themselves unnecessarily, but determined enough to maintain constant pressure. Samuel managed to wound one more attacker, but his ammunition was dwindling, and he knew he couldn't keep up that pace for long. The house that had been his refuge for 16 years was turning into a death trap. It was then that Margaret made a decision that would change everything. Leaving the barn against Samuel's instructions, she walked toward the center of the courtyard, her hands raised but still holding tight to the golden necklace. His voice cut through the morning air like a blade, charged with an authority that surprised even Brennan. She wasn't surrendering. She was offering a deal. The shooting stopped immediately. Brennan stood up from behind his penthouse, his eyes fixed on the necklace that glistened in the morning sun. Margaret stood in the center of the courtyard, vulnerable but defiant, as if she were betting everything on a single desperate move. Samuel could see her from the window of the house, and something about her behavior made him hesitate before yelling at her to go back to safety. Margaret took the necklace from her neck slowly, holding it high for all to see. The jewel caught the sunlight and reflected it in thousands of golden facets, creating a hypnotic spectacle that kept all the men paralyzed for a moment. It was beautiful, undeniably valuable, and represented exactly what Brennan was willing to kill for. But there was something about the way Margaret held her that suggested that her proposal would not be the simple surrender he had hoped for. The tension in the air was so thick that it seemed almost solid. 4 violent men focused on a young woman who held the key to resolving that bloody conflict. Samuel in the house, rifle ready, but waiting to see what play Margaret was making. And at the center of it all, a family heirloom that had become the focal point of a particular war in the middle of the American wilderness. What happened next would define not only who would live or die that day, but also what kind of people they would choose to be when faced with the choice between honor and survival, between what was right and what was easy. Margaret held the necklace a moment longer, her eyes meeting those of each man present, before speaking the words that would change everything. There are times when courage reveals itself not through force, but through the choice to accept one's own vulnerability. Margaret O'Sullivan found this moment in the center of a dusty courtyard, surrounded by armed men who wanted to steal her only inheritance. The golden necklace shone in her hand like a small sun, carrying 27 years of motherly love and precious memories. Thomas Brennan approached slowly, his eyes fixed on the jewel he had chased for weeks. Morrison and the others kept their guns pointed at the house, where Samuel awaited any suspicious movement. The tension cut through the morning air like a sharp blade, everyone waiting for the words Margaret was about to utter. She lifted the necklace higher, her clear voice cutting through the deathly silence. Margaret offered neither surrender nor negotiation. Instead, he did something no one expected. He began to tell the story of his mother, Catherine O'Sullivan, who had crossed the ocean with only dreams and determination. He spoke of the love that had created that jewel, of the nights Catherine had worked to buy it, of the blessings he had whispered as he placed it around his daughter's neck. Brennan quickly lost his temper. He advanced towards Margaret with his hand outstretched, demanding that she hand over the necklace immediately. But she took a step back and did something that chilled the blood of everyone present. Margaret brought the necklace to her lips, kissed it one last time, and then held it over her head with both hands, as if to break the jewel against the stones on the ground. The threat of destroying the very treasure that everyone coveted created a surreal lull in the conflict. Brennan stopped where she was, calculating whether she would have the courage to carry out the threat. Margaret could see the doubt in his eyes, the uncertainty of a man who had planned every detail, except the possibility that the victim would choose to destroy what he wanted to steal. It was Samuel who broke the deadlock. Leaving the house with his hands raised but still holding his rifle, he walked toward the group with slow, deliberate movements. Her eyes met Margaret's for a moment, and she saw something in them that reassured her. He had understood his plan and was willing to support her to the end. Samuel stood beside Margaret, forming a silent alliance in the center of the courtyard. 2 against 4, but united by something stronger than numbers or guns, the conviction that some things were worth more than life itself. Brennan realized that he had lost control of the situation just as his prey had become predatory. What happened next was swift and brutal. Morrison, impatient with negotiations, raised his rifle to force a resolution. But Samuel had anticipated this move. His shot found Morrison before he could fire, and the former soldier fell heavily to the dusty ground. The rest was confusion and gunpowder smoke. Brennan's other 2 men, without Morrison's leadership, lost coordination. One fled. The other was wounded in the arm. Brennan, seeing his plan fall apart, made one last desperate attempt to grab the necklace from Margaret's hands. She did not break the jewel against the stones as she had threatened. Instead, Margaret put it back around her neck, where it had always belonged. Brennan, defeated and abandoned by the few men he had left, departed in a cloud of dust and empty promises of revenge. The silence that followed was different from the previous one. It was a silence of peace, not tension. Samuel and Margaret remained in the courtyard for a long moment, processing what had happened and what it meant for their futures. She had defended his mother's memory, and he had found something he thought he had lost forever, the will to fight for what was right. That afternoon, as they buried Morrison in the small cemetery behind the house, Margaret finally asked the question that had been up in the air throughout the conflict. She asked if she could stay if there was room for her on that lost farm in the middle of the desert. Samuel looked up at the horizon, then at the golden necklace that gleamed against her neck, and smiled for the first time in years. Some inheritances are measured in gold, others measure themselves in the courage to protect what they love. Margaret O'Sullivan had discovered that she possessed both. If this story of courage and family heritage has sparked something in your soul, get ready for more epic adventures of the American Wild West that will stir your emotions. Subscribe to the channel and leave your comment below telling what was the moment that touched your heart the most in this journey of Margaret and Samuel. Was it when she threatened to destroy her mother's necklace, or when Samuel decided to fight for a stranger? Their stories inspire us to create more narratives about courage, honor, and redemption in the Badlands of the Wild West. Don't miss our next adventure. It's coming soon, with more excitement and twists that will leave you breathless.